Hello, everyone. My name is Lynn Griffith. I'm a tropical plant and soil expert. I'm located in Boca Raton, Florida. I've been a horticultural consultant for 42 years. I work all around the United States and in 34 countries around the world. Today, we're going to talk about nematodes. If you've had nematode presentations before, I think you'll find this one to be a bit different, and I hope you'll enjoy it. I'd like to thank Winfield United for putting this whole episode together. I think that's great. The title of the talk is Nematodes from A to Z. It's by me, of course, and what we're going to cover today, general nematode information, nematode biology, nematode population dynamics, how to take samples for nematode assays, cultural and chemical control of dealing with nematodes in turf, and nematodes on ornamentals will be covered briefly. First question, big question. Is it nematode or nematode? You hear it pronounced both ways. My Oxford American Dictionary says that it's nematode with a long E, although you hear it pronounced both ways. I even know nematologists that pronounce it nematode. I really don't think it matters. In phonics, a vowel is followed by a double consonant is a short vowel. So if it was Nemmatode, it would be nematode, but I believe the correct pronunciation is nematode. Comes from the Greek word for thread, nema. When I was a kid, we used to go to Hawaii a lot. My father was an airline pilot and he was also an avid golfer. And I remember that when we would go to Hawaii, the agricultural officials would sterilize my father's golf shoes, his golf spikes. We didn't understand why at the time. It turns out they were trying to kill the nematodes on his golf shoes to protect the Hawaiian pineapple industry. Pineapples are very susceptible to nematodes. In fact, where I live in Boca Raton, Florida, 100 years ago was a pineapple plantation, a lot of it. And then the root knot nematode came in, and we lost our industry because of one little nematode. So, general nematode information. Nematodes are unsegmented cylindrical roundworms. Most are microscopic. However, there is a marine species of nematode that's 3 feet long, and there's one species that actually reaches 30 feet long. Imagine that in your turf. That would be quite a nightmare. For those of you who live up north, they rake up leaves of deciduous trees in the fall and pile them by the curb. I lived outside of New York City for a while as a kid, and I remember playing in the leaves as a child, waiting for the sanitation folks to come by and get the leaves. But you know what? If you leave a pile of leaves like that out by the curb, they disappear eventually, don't they? Where do they go? Well, primarily nematodes eat them. Nematodes are among nature's great recyclers. Most nematodes are what we call free living, which means they devour dead plant and animal tissue. When things die, nematodes are one of the main things that recycles them back to the basic organic molecules, and then nature can assemble them again into plants and animals, etc. And nematodes do this on land, in lakes and streams, and also in the ocean. However, about 15% of nematodes are parasitic. That thing there in the upper right-hand corner of the image is called a stylet. Free-living versus parasitic nematodes. The free-living ones that are just scavengers, they don't have a stylet, they just chew on stuff. Nematodes in general will eat plants, they'll eat animals, they'll eat fungi, they'll eat bacteria, and they'll eat other nematodes. The parasitic nematodes, which attack plants, they all have a stylet, that little thing that sticks out of their snout. The stylet stings root cells, especially near the root tips. Those nematodes feed on the sap of root cells. There is also at least one type of foliar nematode that attacks leaves on plants. Those are not known in turf, and I will not talk about those today, but there are one or two types of foliar feeding nematodes. So here again is a picture of a free-living nematode on the left. Notice there is no stylet. On the right-hand image, you see that there is a retractable stylet in the snout of these nematodes. And these on the right side of the image are, in fact, parasitic nematodes that can attack your grass. There's an image of a nematode penetrating cells and feeding on plant tissue inside on that electron micrograph. This is the basic structure of a nematode. You've got this retractable stylet up at the top. Nematode isn't a whole lot more than a digestive system other than that. And then you've got a reproductive system toward the back end. And that's the basis of nematode morphology, if you will. The life cycle is such. Females will generally lay eggs inside cells in the roots. Those eggs hatch. They may come out of the root. They may stay within the root and feed, but generally they'll come out into the soil to enter healthy roots and feed on them. And again, a lot of the feeding is near the tip of the root, and I'll explain the significance of that in just a moment. How long does a nematode live? I think that's an interesting question. The answer is real simple. About 30 days. Nematodes live about a month. And that's important when you're trying to formulate management strategies in terms of life cycles and longevity and sampling and when do you repeat your applications, things of that sort. By themselves, nematodes will only move about a foot a year. If you noticed in those pictures of nematodes, you didn't see any legs on them, did you? Thank goodness nematodes don't have legs or they'd be really a nightmare. So they move laterally only about a foot a year. And if you do the math, that's 12 months. That's about 12 inches. Nematodes don't move laterally very much. Therefore, bad patches of nematode infestations in a lawn will not expand very rapidly. They get moved, however, by animals or soil insects or turf equipment or spikes or just people walking on the grass. Nematodes are moved more than they move themselves. Primarily, nematodes move up and down depending on soil moisture levels and temperature. Think of a nematode as a little bag of water. That's basically what it is. And they need to move up and down depending on temperature and moisture to try to be in the best conditions possible for their survival. And so they tend to move up and down more than they do laterally. They also help move soil-borne pathogens around. Soil-borne pathogens can blow or be splashed in water to move around, but nematodes also move good old fungi around in your turf grass and can help pathogens spread. Two interesting facts. The first place nematodes were ever reported to be a problem on Bermuda grass was in Florida, where I am. More species of nematodes attack turf grass than any other crop. With most crops out there, there might be one or two nematodes that'll attack a particular crop, but in turf grass, you can have 6 or 8 or 10 different nematodes attacking your grass. The average tablespoon of healthy field soil contains 4 billion microorganisms. That's right, billion. If you cup your hands together and fill them with soil, you are holding more microorganisms in your hands than there are people on this planet. That's how microbially active soil is. An acre of soil, 6 2/3 inches deep, contains 800 cubic yards of soil and weighs an average of 2 million pounds. These are basic tenets of agronomy. Therefore, 1,000 square feet of lawn will contain 8.7 cubic yards of soil in the top 3 inches. I chose the top 3 inches because that in most lawns is about the root zone area. Every nematode counted in your assay or your nematode test per 100 cc's of soil translates to 70 nematodes in that 1,000 square feet of turf. That's just a 20-foot by 50-foot section of turf. So when you look at your nematode counts on your assay, there's really a lot more nematodes in that lawn than you're seeing in that test. Imagine how many nematodes are feeding on that lawn when you multiply those numbers each by 70. So no wonder that grass is having a hard time making a living. There's about 24 species of parasitic nematodes that feed on turf grass. This is actually Bermuda grass green. In this case, you can see where they've tried to patch in with some sod to try and get it to recover, but this turf is just clobbered with nematode activity. Sting nematode is one of the major turf grass nematodes. It's also one of the largest plant parasitic nematodes. It can reach about 1/8 of an inch long, which, if you think about it, is actually visible with the naked eye. However, it needs soil having at least 80% sand in order to move and feed on the sap of root cells. If you're in a part of the country where you have clay soils or really tight, dense soils, sting nematodes probably cannot make a living because they can't move around. They're too big. Sting nematodes, in most parts of the country, their populations will tend to peak about May. The populations tend to drop in July when it gets hot. And when it gets hot like that, they will tend to go deep in the hot weather in order to just get down to where the soil is cooler so they can maintain the moisture levels in their body. A sting nematode will live a little longer, about 4 to 6 weeks typically. And in the spring, they become active when the soil temperature reaches 50 to 60 degrees. Lance nematodes are another type of major nematode affecting turfgrass. The lance nematode will tunnel through roots, injecting hormones as they go in order to establish feeding sites within the roots. And they kind of move in and out of the roots as they're feeding. They are endoparasitic but migratory. What that means is they operate inside the roots, but they'll also come out of the root and move to other parts of the roots within your turf grass. Another problem with lance nematodes is that many of the available nematicides are not very effective in controlling lance. In other words, lance is one of the hardest nematodes to control. There's two basic classes of nematodes, ectoparasitic and endoparasitic. The sting nematodes, stubby root, spiral, and ring are all what we call ectoparasitic. That means that they operate from the outside. They feed from the outside as opposed to within the root. And that's an image there of an ectoparasitic nematode. The endoparasitic nematodes are those that work within the roots themselves. These are root knot nematodes. The only nematode that makes knots in roots is the root knot nematode. A lot of people think that if you have a nematode issue, you should see knots. Well, that's not really true because there are 23 different classes of nematodes that do not make knots. You don't necessarily have to see knots to have a nematode problem. You often in turfgrass find root knot nematodes in the thatch layer. Nematodes like thatch. There's a lot of vegetation to feed on in the thatch layer. So make sure when you take a nematode sample that you include the thatch in your sample, or else you might miss some of the nematodes, especially root knot. Symptoms of root knot in turfgrass: you get stunting, you get yellowing, you may get premature wilting in part of the lawn, but not necessarily all of it. Failure to respond to fertilizer is one of the keys to diagnosing nematode problems. As experienced turfgrass managers and lawn spray companies, etc., you know what to expect from a fertilizer application. However, if you put fertilizer down and you just don't get the type of response that you're accustomed to seeing and that you're expecting, assuming there isn't a weather factor, you may well have a nematode issue, or at least that should suggest to you that you may be dealing with a nematode problem. Another symptom that I'll show you in a moment with nematodes is you tend to get shallow, oddly branched roots, or you may see knots in roots. The knots with root knot nematode are more difficult to see in turfgrass than they are in most crops. Again, symptoms of root knot nematodes or really nematodes in general, you'll have affected areas and clumps which will slowly enlarge. Remember that nematodes don't move laterally very fast, so the bad spots won't grow quickly. If you get a patch of turf that goes down really fast, that's not a nematode problem. That's probably fungus. Fungus can move very quickly, but nematodes don't move quickly. The root knot nematode will often leave yellow blotches in the turf. Again, the knots are hard to see. I wouldn't go by that. The ectoparasitic nematodes, which again work from the outside, often show short, stubby roots because they're attacking the root tip and they're causing the root to branch. Then they attack the branch portion of the roots and the roots branch again, so you get excessively branched roots in your turf. With endoparasitic nematodes that work inside, the roots appear darkened and rotten looking. And I'll show you what that looks like. You hear about spurge. A lot of people think if you have spurge weeds, that's what this broadleaf weed is right here. Spurge grows in most of the country. About the only place you don't get spurge is up in the Northeast. A lot of people think that if you see spurge weeds in a lawn that you've got a nematode problem. Well, the answer really is maybe. If you're fighting spurge in a lawn, it might suggest that you may have a nematode problem, but not necessarily. The reason is that nematodes don't really like to feed on spurge. They'd rather feed on the grass. So just use the spurge as kind of maybe a partial indicator that you might have a nematode issue. Yeah, I talked about the branching a minute ago. These are ectoparasitic nematode activity here on the left, where you see excessive branching and the roots really don't go very far. The image on the right is basically nematode free, and you see the roots are not branching and they're expanding very deeply, and you've got nice root hair formation. You have poor root hair formation on the left, and obviously if I was grass, I'd rather be with a root system like you see on the right side of this slide rather than what you see on the left. With the endoparasitic nematodes that work within the roots, such as lance, root knot, and lesion, you have roots that look more as if they're infected by disease. You have darkened roots that don't necessarily branch excessively. They'll branch somewhat, but when you have healthy nematode-free turf, the roots basically go straight down, which is helpful if you're a grass plant, because if it's a little dry, where do you want to be? You want to be down deep where there's some good moisture. Roots grow where the moisture is. Again, think of a nematode as a skinny bag of water, because that's basically what it is. Once nematodes die, they decompose very quickly, 2 or 3 days, and they're not detectable anymore. And that'll come into play here in a few minutes when we talk about sampling. But again, when a nematode dies, it breaks down very fast. The carcasses don't stick around because, again, it's basically a bag of water, and the microbes in the soil, those 4 billion microbes per tablespoon of soil, they're going to devour that dead nematode very quickly. Okay, population dynamics, meaning how do the populations vary throughout the year? In the north, nematode populations peak in the midsummer, which is not hard to imagine. And then in the winter, cold weather kills most of them. Some may survive in the subsoil, but cold weather is going to get most of them. And the further north you go, or the colder it gets, that's going to be more of a problem. Nematodes can, of course, be reintroduced to nematode-free turf by lawnmowers, by people walking, by animals, dogs, whatever. They find a way to get back in, even if they've been eradicated by weather. In Florida, which I know most of you are not in, but this is illustrative, in North Florida, the populations slow down in the wintertime. And if you're in, say, the Mid-South or the central and northern parts of the United States, you're going to see significant slowdown of nematode populations in the winter. For comparison, North Florida is generally in Zone 8, USDA Zone 8. In Central Florida, the populations slow down somewhat. That's Zone 9. In South Florida, in the tropics, they really don't slow down at all. So if you're in a tropical or subtropical location, the nematodes are not going to slow down a lot for you. And once again, just to belabor the point, nematodes move up and down in the soil with temperature and with moisture levels. Sampling. Okay, we figured out we might have a nematode problem. How do we go about determining, do we in fact have a nematode problem? Number one, and this is very, very important, nematodes are not at all evenly distributed in soil. Remember, they don't move very much laterally. They don't move very fast. So their populations are not at all uniform. Do not expect them to be, because they're not going to be. The nematode counts under your left foot, in fact, may be completely different than the nematode counts under your right foot. Even though your feet may be 18 inches apart, you can have a completely different nematode population situation, just varying by a small distance. You are sampling something when you're sampling for nematodes that's intrinsically variable. Intrinsic means of or belonging to by its nature. You're sampling something, again, that's intrinsically variable. You are, in essence, sampling the wind. If I walk outside of my house right now and sample the wind and it's out of the east at 8 miles an hour, can I say that that's what the weather was like on December 10th or November 10th? No, wind is a variable thing. So you have to take multiple samples to get an accurate reading of what the wind was on a particular day. Nematode populations are the same way. Therefore, when you're sampling a lawn, you should take numerous cores, generally 15 to 25 subsamples or probings for that lawn. You should only sample to the depth of the root zone, and you need to basically determine how deep is the root system in this lawn. If you go deeper with your sampling than the depth of the roots, you're going to dilute the counts. The nematodes are going to stay where the roots are. If you imagine a baseball diamond where you have a dirt infield and then infield and outfield grass, you can have significant nematode populations in the infield and outfield grass, but you're not going to find nematodes in that dirt infield because there's no turf for them to feed on. They're not going to survive very long. Also, if you really suspect a nematode problem, it would help to take more than one sample, maybe a front yard, backyard, and one or two side yards, depending on the way the lawn is laid out. But it helps to take multiple samples. Nematode testing is not expensive. It's not a big deal. Okay, when do you sample? In warm climates, I don't think it matters much. Where I live in the tropics, it doesn't matter. If you live in the middle to northern climates of the United States, probably spring and summer are the best times. Remember that the populations tend to get going in the spring when that soil temperature reaches roughly 55 degrees. And if there is a nematode problem, those nematode populations will build up over the summer. So basically, spring and summer are probably ideal for the more northern climates, but it really depends on where you are in the country and what the weather is like. Some sampling tips. That's a trusty soil probe there. I use one kind of like that in a good plastic bucket. Number one, leave the plug or thatch layer on the plug when you put it in your bucket after sampling. A lot of nematodes can live in that thatch. And this really goes for soil sampling too. If you're taking soil samples for nutrients and pH and things like that, leave the thatch layer on. Some people say pull it off. Do not do that. I don't believe in adulterating a sample. The key word in sampling is representative. That sample that's going in that bag needs to be representative of the situation in that lawn. Otherwise, you're wasting your time and your money. So whether it's soil for nutrients or soil for nematode assays, leave the thatch layer on. Where do you sample? Sample at the edge of the affected areas. If you've got a really bad spot on a lawn and you go to the middle of that bad spot, there's probably not going to be many nematodes there because they've already moved out further toward the edge of the good area. Nematodes, again, need to have grass to feed on. Many times I've been asked to sample a bad area and a good area, and you find more nematodes in the good area than the bad area. And they say, oh, you got the samples mixed up. No, I didn't. The problem is that when turf is really weak and thin, you're not going to find many nematodes there. So concentrate your sampling. If there are affected areas, sample the edges of the affected areas. That's where the nematodes are going to be if they're there. Sample at a consistent depth. Once again, generally 3 inches or so, depending on the depth of the root system of your grass. If you go too deep, you're diluting your counts. When you're doing nematicide trials or comparisons, try to sample in exactly the same locations. Remember that a foot and a half can make a lot of difference in what a nematode population is in a soil. Laboratories. The methodologies for nematode testing today are pretty standard. Most labs pretty much use all the same extracting procedures. They actually make what's called a sucrose density gradient, and they float the nematodes to the proper density, and then they extract them and count them and identify them. Most laboratories in the eastern part of the United States report nematode tests per 100 cc's of soil. If you remember from 6th grade science or high school science, if you remember 100 cc graduated cylinder, well, they're reporting nematode counts per 100 cc's. In the West, it's maybe more popular to report per 500 cc's of soil or sometimes per pint of soil. The efficiency of extraction is important. That's why it's important to use a good nematode lab. Many universities will offer nematode testing. There are also some good private nematologists out there that are operating. I use one in Phoenix, Arizona, and have for many years, and I get real good service from that laboratory. Treatment thresholds. These are treatment thresholds for 3 different types of grass in Florida. I know you're not all in Florida, but these rating standards or thresholds are pretty good for a lot of different types of turf. If you notice in these 3 different types of grass, the nematode rating standards are about the same. They don't vary very much. So if you got fescue or Kentucky bluegrass or some other kind of turf in a more northern or western clime, generally, your laboratory can interpret your nematode assay for you and tell you whether your counts are high enough to warrant treatment or not. The lab can generally tell you that. If they can't, you can probably find standards online, but also these rating standards are a rough guide. Notice something else. Take a look at the sting nematode populations. If you have between 10 and 25 nematodes per 100 cc's of sting, and or worse, higher than that, you've got a big problem. But look at the spiral nematode. You need to have 1,500 before you start worrying about it. So the quantities of nematodes vary a great deal in terms of when should I start to worry. Basically, some of the nematodes are a lot worse than others. However, treatment thresholds are not the be all and end all. Again, if you got turf that's not very healthy, you might not see a lot of nematodes there, even though that may be your primary problem in your lawn. Treatment thresholds are just one criterion. Other factors, of course, are turf health and condition, the season, the type of turf you have, budgetary considerations come into play, etc. Whoops, sorry about that. This often happens in this 4th bullet here. A lot of times you may not have one nematode count that might be excessive, but you have a whole bunch of them in the medium range, and still there may be enough counts and kinds of nematodes to warrant treatment, even though none of them are excessive. Where I live, you often see in a nematode assay 4 or 5 different kinds of nematodes in a sample. In other parts of the country, that may be different, but my point is this: sometimes one count will be excessive and you have primarily one nematode species to deal with. At other times, you likely will have multiple different types. And this refers to Florida in this last bullet point, but if you send a nematode sample in and it's a warm time of year and you don't find any nematodes at all, you may want to get another sample. That sample may have gotten hot in a UPS truck somewhere. Okay, cultural controls. What do I do culturally if I have a nematode population or even think I have a nematode population? Well, if possible, raise the mowing height. That will give you more leaf area, which will help encourage more root growth. If nematodes are attacking the roots of your lawn, you need to find a way to expand the root system in that lawn, and raising the height of cut will help if you're able to. Secondly, avoid excessive nitrogen applications. High nitrogen can negatively affect the shoot to root ratio in the favor of shoots. And when you have nematodes, you want to be favoring root growth. Additional phosphorus and potassium in the fertilizer program may also help with root development. Phosphorus will build up in an older lawn that's been fertilized for a long time, but potassium often won't, especially in wetter climates. Potassium leaches quite a bit, phosphorus doesn't. Water deeply where possible. I don't necessarily mean more often, but when you do irrigate, when you have nematode problems, water a bit longer than usual to get that water further down into the soil. Aerify the turf where appropriate. That's, of course, a seasonal thing. You generally don't want to be aerifying in the colder months, but if you can aerify that particular type of grass, that will help. If you have bad spots in your lawn, in your aerifying, aerify the bad areas last, okay? Do all the good areas first and then aerify the bad patches last. Otherwise, you may be spreading nematodes around the yard, and that's not what we're about here. I'll talk briefly about nematodes in ornamentals. Nematodes are a problem in ornamentals. Nematodes cause billions of dollars of crop losses around the world, and they can be a significant problem in ornamental plants as well. I know some of you may not deal with ornamentals, but I'm betting a lot of you do. Some susceptible species, those on the left are generally the warmer season, more tropical crops like impatiens, mondo grass, Liriope pittosporum. Maui exora is very nematode sensitive. So are some palms. Queen palms and date palms are nematode sensitive. Citrus trees are nematode sensitive. Bougainvillea, very much so. Ageratum, impatiens, alyssum, dianthus in the annual area, and vinca as well. And also in the shrubs for the more northern maintenance folks, you got azaleas, you got boxwoods, you've got holly, you've got junipers. Roses are very susceptible to nematodes. There's a lot of types of ornamental plants that are also nematode sensitive. In the ornamentals, the root knot nematodes are primarily the ones you're dealing with. And if you have a nematode issue in some of the varieties that you see on this slide, those more than likely would be root knot nematodes, although there certainly are exceptions. A couple of marigolds that are nematode resistant are marigolds and taurinia. These annuals are very resistant to nematodes. So if you've got a nematode infected annual bed somewhere and you want to try to escape that problem, think about rotating with marigolds or taurinia. Taurinia is a nice annual. It needs a lot of water, however. Marigolds actually secrete chemicals into the soil that either repel or kill nematodes. I've seen people plant nematodes in between other nematode susceptible plants in order to kind of help protect the susceptible plants. Are there control options for nematodes in residential lawns? I can't tell you how many times I've had pest control operators, even owners of pest control companies say, oh no, there's nothing you can do if you have nematodes in a residential lawn. There's nothing registered. There's nothing available. Folks, baloney. That's just plain wrong. You do have options if you have a nematode problem in a lawn. There are several of them, as you can see here, and I'll go through them real quick. One is called Almighty. It is made from geranium oil or geraniol. This is actually a certified organic nematicide. So if you have, say, a homeowner that doesn't like to use chemicals or is worried about their dog or their cat or their kids, which of course is legitimate, you can use a certified organic nematicide such as Almighty. I have trialed this myself and it works. Another good one is Azagard, which is made from neem oil. It's about 70% neem oil. Very good product, very safe around children and pets. There was another one called Diterra that I did a lot of work with in the 90s. It's actually a fermentation product. I'm told that this product is not currently available. Some people say that Diterra didn't work. I have other people that love it. I think it really depends on how you use it, but it is not currently being manufactured. Excuse me. Another very good one is Indemnify, which is fluopyram. This is a very effective and very popular nematicide. Neotech is made from sesame oil. It is available and it works pretty well, at least on certain types of nematodes. Nimitz is fluensulfone. It is not currently available. It's not being manufactured. Although with both Diterra and Nimitz, I suspect somebody may pick these products up and begin to manufacture and market them again. Nordica is a beneficial bacillus bacterium, and it has some efficacy on some nematode types as well. In the old days, for those of you who've been around, when we had Nemacure and Mocap and Counter and Triumph in these old-fashioned nematodes, many of those nematicides worked on pretty much all nematodes. The newer products are much less toxic and much safer, but they don't necessarily work on all nematodes. So part of your decision-making process, if you're going to treat a lawn for nematodes, is first question, what kind of nematodes do I have? and then determine which would be the best for your situation. If you're not sure, generally the nematicide labels will give you some clues about that. You can also talk to your vendor, your salesperson about, okay, I have this kind of nematode, which would be my best product. You can also talk to the manufacturer's reps and find out what they have to say about how good is this product against that nematode. Nematode management is not in most turf maintenance contracts. Sometimes here in the tropics they are, but most of the time they are not. So if you discover a lawn that you've been treating has a nematode problem, that may be an add-on in terms of cost and billing, because again, nematodes are not normally in turf maintenance contracts. You'll have your fertilization requirements, you'll have your weed control, you'll have your fungicides, you'll have your insecticides in a contract. And if you're mowing, you may have to mow a certain number of times per year, but nematodes are often not addressed. This is actually a picture of a nematode eating another nematode. So if your normal treatments, most of you in the lawn care business, you have your little tricks, you have your go-tos, you have your things that you know, things that have worked for you many times for years. So if your normal treatments that you normally do, such as fertilizing, iron applications, fungicides, insecticides, wetting agents, micronutrients, classical music, whatever you normally do to get a lawn to respond, if it's not working, then you might think about nematodes and maybe running a nematode assay like we talked about earlier. Again, failure to respond to fertilizer in a normal fashion is one of the real clues that you may have a nematode issue. Also, again, excessively branched roots or root systems that are very shallow, much shallower than normal. Many times the nematodes are feeding on those roots and the plant just can't deal with the sunlight and the heat and the wind, and they start to decline like this. A few final thoughts. Nematicides virtually never eradicate nematode populations. It's kind of like fleas on your dog. If you have fleas on your dog and you treat your dog for fleas, you'll get rid of most of the fleas, but they're going to come back eventually. And nematicides and nematodes are the same way. You don't totally wipe them out. In fact, a good nematicide product will generally lower a nematode count by about 50% after one application and generally about 80% after two applications. Once again, some of the newer products don't work equally well on all species, but this 50% after one application and 80% after two, what I'm really saying there is if you have a significant nematode problem in one of your lawns, it will help to put out a nematicide and repeat that application in 2 to 4 weeks. If you can knock that population down 50% after one application, and then you can kick them when they're down, meaning I've killed half of you, now I'm going to come try to kill the rest of you, you get better efficacy than if you just have one application. If your nematode problem is not that severe and your counts are lower, one application may be sufficient. Of course, budgeting comes into play. The nematicide products are generally not cheap. They can be a fairly significant cost. So keep an eye on those. If you're serious about this, you might look at the products I mentioned a few slides back and figure out what your cost is per 1,000 square feet, excuse me, and figure which nematicide you might want to apply. They're all roughly in the same zone in terms of cost, but nematicides are not inexpensive. 30 days after treatment is a good interval to sample depending on the product, meaning if you believe or come to know that you have a nematode issue and want to do a treatment, if you want to check to see how well the nematicide has worked, number one, turf response is a good indicator. It'll generally take a couple of weeks after a treatment before you see response in the turf. If you have a severe nematode issue, that turf should start to respond in a couple of weeks. But another way to tell, of course, is to run a second assay, and about 30 days after treatment is a good time to do that, once again, because the nematode will live about 30 days. Thank you, folks. My name again is Lynn Griffith. I am a tropical plant and soil expert. That is me at the Miami Dolphins football stadium. You can reach me at 561 231-1407. My website is www.lynngriffith.com. You can check that out if you like. And I thank you for your attendance today. I certainly look forward to hearing from you. And thanks to Winfield for sponsoring this event.